Hello. Today's lecture is going to focus on Chapter 3, Solving Problems Analytically. The next lecture that you'll listen to will focus strictly on kind of the creative problem solving. But I broke the two chapters up, broke the one chapter up into two kind of mini lectures. So we're going to go through just the basic steps of solving problems analytically. And what that really is alluding to is having kind of this framework. So even when we talk about solving problems creatively, we're still going to use this analytical kind of process. The creative process is just going to insert some different techniques to try to help us define the problem maybe a little more creatively and come up with more creative solutions. All right. So I always have issues. There we go. The other thing with the analytical model before I get into step one is that it really assumes that we have all this time to solve this issue. All right, so it's kind of like this ideal approach to problem solving. And so these are just things that we want to keep in mind. We're not always going to be able to implement every little thing within each step because of time constraints, because of budget, because of limited resources. Those things are true constraints on the problem solving process. But this at least gives you an idea of what you should be thinking about at each stage of the analytical process. So the first step is to define the problem. A typical kind of misstep early on in the process is that we just start solving the issue without truly defining what the issue is. We jump in because we don't like problems, we don't like that uncertainty, and so we try to solve it right away. When in reality, we really need to sit down and spend a lot of time on this step, on defining the problem, making sure that we're working with factual information. So we're able to kind of look at all this information that we've gathered and look at, okay, what's fact, what's hearsay, what's opinion, and really be able to differentiate between those two. Make sure that we're asking everyone, we're getting other people involved to get their perspective on what they think the problem is, or to get information from more than just one source. Again, we don't always have that time, that capability to do that, but ideally we can go to more than just one source for the information to make sure that we are getting a well-rounded picture. We want to make sure that we avoid, again, stating the problem as a disguised solution. So, again, that's jumping into solving the issue before we've explicitly stated the problem. So we should spend a lot of time here because the rest of the steps, there's 4 steps in this process, the rest of them fall back on this step one, right? So once we identify the problem, now we start resolving the problem. We start coming up with solutions. And so if we define the problem incorrectly, then obviously we're going to be coming up with solutions that truly aren't going to solve the issue. So we really want to make sure that we are defining the problem. We're asking why, right? So if we get into an issue, we identify a problem, asking ourselves, well, why is that happening? Right? And that helps us maybe get to an underlying cause. Okay, well, this is happening because of this. Well, why is that happening? All right, and so that helps us dig a lot deeper. So we're not just kind of dealing with the symptoms, but we're truly getting down to kind of the core problem. And for this class, when we're working with our cases, that's the fundamental management problem. That's what we're trying to get to, right? So you're going to have a lot of information in these cases that you're reading. You're going to have to differentiate what is necessary information and what information do I just ignore, and then ask that question, well, why? Why are these employees not getting along, or why can't we make a profit, or and really try to dig and ask yourself that question a couple of times to really make sure that you're not just dealing with a symptom, but truly getting to the core problem, or the FMP. Once you feel comfortable and you've explicitly stated, meaning you've written that problem out, the problem is, and you've stated that, and everyone on the team is on board with that, now you move to step 2, and now we start generating different solutions, right? So this would be the next section of your case paper, your case write-up. And so now you're going to come up with, for the case, hopefully you generate a lot of different solutions. You just brainstorm different solutions. You know, at this point, it's quantity over quality, right? We just want a whole bunch of solutions, right? A whole bunch of options. We're not evaluating at this step. We're just brainstorming, right? We're trying to get everybody involved in this process. All right. For your paper's sake, you're going to identify your top 3 alternatives. All right. So after you've kind of had this big brainstorming session, then you'll move on to step 3, and you'll identify kind of your top 3, and then ultimately your top recommendation. But here in step 2, you're going to generate as many as you can. You want to think about short-term and long-term solutions, which is something that you might want to think about for your cases. Some cases really lend themselves to, all right, we have the short timeline. We need to resolve this issue kind of immediately. So what's a short-term fix? And then long-term, all right, what's something that we can do long-term to prevent this from happening again, you know, where the short-term is really just a Band-Aid, all right, but now let's think long-term. So you can kind of think in both ways for your cases as well. Build on other ideas, right? So as people share ideas, you know, break them apart, combine ideas, right? So this is kind of the part where there's no evaluating. We're just trying to come up with as many options as possible. Once you feel like you've had a good brainstorming session, you have a lot of different options out there, now you're going to move on to step 3, and now you're going to start evaluating, right? So there's no evaluating in step 2. Step 3, you start evaluating and ultimately come to your recommendation, the solution you're going to select. So during this phase, ideally, the more systematic you can make it, the easier it is. So if you can, before you even start evaluating, you think about what criteria must a solution meet for us to accept, right? So is there budget concerns that you need to be aware of? Is there a time schedule that we need to make sure that we adhere to? You know, there's a lot of different things, you know, how likely will the employees accept this solution, right? So we want to think about these different criteria that we're needing to meet. And so now as we go through each solution, we can say, all right, solution 1, you know, is it cost effective, right? Does it meet, can we do this within the budget that we have? Can we do this within the time frame that we have? You know, and if we can check all those boxes, then we put it into one pile, you know, and those solutions that don't meet all those, you know, can't check all those boxes, goes into a different pile, you know, and so then it helps us kind of start, you know, narrowing our list of those options. So you can kind of have a systematic approach that definitely works better at this stage. All right, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how this impacts the goals, whether it's the goal of the department, the goal of the organization, right? So you want to think about those things, the culture of the organization. This might be a really good solution, but does it fit for this organization, for their culture, for the employees that they have? So you need to really take that into consideration as important, you know, things to consider, right? And so once you've done that evaluation, then you ultimately select your recommended solution moving forward. So for your case analysis for your paper, you'll identify your top 3 alternatives. And in that section of your paper, you'll talk about each alternative, you know, describe it a little bit, and then maybe evaluate it, you know, talk about the pros and cons of each solution. And then in the third section of your paper is your recommended solution, right? So of those 3 that you highlight in your paper, which one are you proposing that the organization move forward with, right? And you talk about, well, why did you choose that one? What criteria did you look at and say, this was the best of the 3 that we came up with? And so then in that section, that's what you, in that third section of your paper, you're identifying the recommended solution. Right, and then the fourth step and the fourth part of your paper is your action plan, and this essentially is step 4 of the problem-solving model, and looking at how to implement and follow up on the solution selected. So you can see here that you need to think about kind of the timing of when you implement. You need to provide kind of those steps. What does it take to actually implement this solution, right? And so that's what your action plan is going to identify. What step needs to be taken? Who's in charge of that step? How long do you think that step will take? Is it a week? Is it a day? Is it, whatever that timing is? This will look and should feel very similar to a work breakdown structure that you'll be doing or have done for as part of your kind of casework. So there is some similarities there. The biggest part of this step is the follow-up. All right, making sure that you're coming back 3 months, 6 months later and saying, is the problem gone? Did we resolve the issue? And if not, looking to see what went wrong. Did we define the problem incorrectly? Or did maybe the solution not get implemented like it should have, and people weren't as diligent with the steps and they ignored the steps, and that's why it didn't get resolved, right? So going back and making sure that the solution did work, the problem did get resolved, and if not, taking some steps to correct that. Some constraints that you might fall into or see at each step, I'll go through these kind of quickly here. So when you're defining the problem, some of the bigger challenges at this stage is, the lack of consensus. You're working in a group, so it might be hard to get everyone on the same page with what you think the problem is. So that becomes probably the biggest hurdle. So once everyone does agree, right, then we really have to move forward with that problem. Right? There might be other problems that were really good and everybody liked, but if we agree on whatever, problem definition we come up with, then that's the problem that we need to try to resolve moving forward. The other big challenge at this stage is that there's just a lot of information. In real situations, you're gathering a lot of information, you're asking, different people involved in the issue, and getting a lot of maybe conflicting information. And so really trying to differentiate, fact and opinion, and all this information that's coming in can be really challenging and confusing. So those are some true, challenges at this first step. And so that's why we really want to spend a good portion of our time making sure that we do take time to get through all that information and define the problem as accurately as we can. The biggest challenge when generating alternatives is evaluating too early, right? So as people propose solutions, we might say, well, that wouldn't work, or that's way too expensive, or we only have a month, and so that's that evaluating. We're already saying, not happening. And what potentially could happen is that could shut down other people in the group. Or I might evaluate internally and say, I have this idea, but it might be too expensive, so I'm not even going to volunteer it. I'm not even going to say it, right? Well, so now I don't say that alternative, and maybe that would have jogged somebody else's memory, or somebody could have built off of my idea. So if we evaluate, sometimes we start restricting others from participating. And so that becomes, a challenge for the group, and potentially, prevents us from coming up with a really good solution. The other challenge here, or something that's easy to do, is accepting the first solution that sounds good, right? So someone comes up with this solution, it sounds really good and kind of creative. So yeah, let's do that. All right, and so we just move on, and we don't fully brainstorm other possibilities, because there might have been another really good solution out there too, but we stopped too early and just jumped on the first good one that we heard. So again, just want to be aware of some of these constraints to make sure that we don't fall into some of those traps. Step 3, when we start evaluating and selecting an alternative, during the evaluation process, there's research that has to be done to see if these solutions are possible or how much they cost. And sometimes we just are limited on the information that we have, or we just maybe ask one source. We try to get all our information from one source, and we don't really try to expand that to sources kind of further out from us. So the type of information that we get might be pretty limited. The other big constraint is that it's costly. It's timely to gather all this information on all the alternatives. And so because of that cost or that time or those limited resources, we might not fully evaluate the options like we should. But those are real constraints, and sometimes those do prevent us from doing a full evaluation, and we have to use the limited resources that we do have access to. The last step is with the implementation and follow-up stage. The biggest challenge here is that resistance. So we come up with a solution, and this is something that will be a common challenge for your group as consultants. You're coming into this organization and you're saying, hey, here's a solution we need you to implement, right? So you're telling them that they need to implement this solution in order to hopefully solve this problem. And people, are really hesitant to do something different, especially if it's going to take more effort, or they're maybe not sure if they're going to be able to implement this solution. They're not very knowledgeable about what you're asking them to do. And so that uncertainty there will also cause some resistance. So make sure that you're thinking about that as you're coming up with solutions. How can you do this? How can you implement this solution and get everybody on board with it pretty quickly, so we don't have to waste time trying to overcome that resistance, okay? And sometimes a challenge here is that it might take a long time to implement a solution. We always are looking for quick results. Sometimes, it might take a little bit, it might take a little longer to get the results that we're looking for. And so being willing to be patient, being willing to monitor. But it is hard to know, when do we stop? When do we stop investing in this solution because it's not working, versus, we need to give it more time. So those are challenges, and those are things that, managers and organizations have to really consider. All right, so that's the analytical approach to problem solving. There's 4 steps. Those 4 steps are the same steps really that you're going to be implementing in your case analysis. Coming up with identifying the problem, coming up with alternative solutions to the problem that you've identified, providing a recommended solution, and then putting an action plan together. And so in each of those sections, make sure that you're looking at these slides and saying, all right, are we doing these things? Did we make sure that we were looking at the correct information, and we were looking at information and not just opinions from employees. Making sure that you're going through the brainstorming step, coming up with those alternatives. All right, and then also, being aware of some of these constraints that can easily pop up at during the different steps that you're taking in this process. All right, so I do have a few questions that to kind of test your knowledge to see if how well you picked up on this information. So I'm just going to read the problem, I'll read the options, and then if you want to pause it, feel free to pause it before I reveal the answer, but I'm not going to leave a lot of time in between me reading the solutions and explaining the answer. So please feel free to pause if you want to try to come up with the answer before I reveal it. So there's 3 or 4 questions I think that I added to this deck. So what is the natural tendency of people in resolving problems? A, select the best solution after evaluating all the alternatives. B, select the first reasonable problem that comes to mind. C, select the first reasonable solution that comes to mind, or D, none of the answer choices are correct. So again, pause, or here we go. So the answer here is C. The natural tendency of people when problems arise is to start solving it, all right? And we don't always do a good job of first defining that problem, right? So it's a very natural tendency to try to resolve that conflict, to resolve that uncertainty with a solution. Your team has experienced an increase in absenteeism in the past 6 weeks. In the meeting to define the problem, George recommends that personal leave days be abolished. The group ignores that suggestion, but instead decides to fire all employees who are absent starting Monday. What went wrong in the decision-making process? A, the problem was stated as part of the solution. B, the problem was stated too explicitly. C, the information about the problem was based on speculation. Or D, the first acceptable solution was accepted. So the answer to this one is A. The problem was stated as part of the solution, right? So the problem was never identified, this increase in absenteeism in the past. Well, why? What's the issue here, right? What's the real problem? And so we never really dug into that. So it wasn't stated explicitly, especially not too explicitly, right? So B is definitely not an option. There's no speculation in the information that was provided in this scenario. And the first acceptable solution, was accepted. The first solution was ignored, right? And so there wasn't a ton of information on that as well. But you started seeing they're meeting to define the problem, and we start saying, what we should do is this, right? And we start providing that solution, and so we're kind of falling into that problem was stated as part of the solution type of constraint. So we want to be careful with that. Your group has agreed to do a skit as part of its presentation to the class. Bob believes a beach skit with everyone wearing swimsuits would liven up the presentation. Someone in the group remarked, "What a stupid idea," which I do agree with. What step in the analytical problem-solving method is violated by this response? A, define the problem. B, implement and follow up. C, generate alternative solutions. D, evaluate and select an alternative. The answer here is C, generate alternative solutions. So remember that step 2 of the problem solving, we're just brainstorming ideas of, potentially what we should do for our skit. Bob, whether it's a good or bad idea, shares his thoughts, and we're already evaluating. Okay, what a stupid idea, right? So that's evaluating the idea, and really at this step, at the generating alternative solutions, that is something that we really want to avoid doing. Last one, what is accomplished by implementing a solution incrementally, right? So A, increases the overall or total cost. B, creates support with only a few people at a time. C, decreases resistance by others to the solution. D, helps give people a break during implementation. So for the answer here, it's C, decreases resistance by others to the solution. So one of the constraints that we discussed during the implementation phase is this resistance. So if we can take kind of this approach where we implement it slowly and we kind of do a little bit at a time, the idea here is people aren't resistant to small changes, right? Easy changes. Well, I can do that. That's no big deal. Okay. And so if I can do smaller changes along the way, it doesn't feel like this big, massive change at the end. All right. So we want to think about that because that does decrease that resistance, and that's a big constraint or a big challenge at that phase of the problem-solving process. All right, so that's the analytical problem-solving approach with some of the constraints involved. The next lecture will look at implementing some creative techniques into this process when maybe the solution isn't that clear, right? And so now we got to get creative because I really don't know how I'm going to solve this issue. All right, that's next in the next lecture. All right, see you guys.